Imagine visiting a country and then discovering that God puts on your heart a need that maybe you didn't even realize was there. Imagine wanting to go back to that country and make an impact. And imagine having to leave your careers and your life in America to do that. Well, that's just what our guest and her husband did this week on Missions Today. And we've got a lot of story to tell. We're going to cram it into a little bit of time, but we're so glad to welcome Echo VanderWal. She's the executive director of the Luke Commission. Echo, thanks so much for your time today and being with us on Missions Today.
Thanks a lot, Colin. Thanks for having us.
Let's start with the Luke Commission. Give us kind of a high-level view. What's it all about?
Well, in 2004, my husband and I came to Eswatini for the first time after being called as young children to work overseas in healthcare. And when we came, we dropped into the epicenter of the worst of the HIV pandemic in the whole world. And we really felt that God was asking us to go to the people where they were. We saw huge barriers in people having access to transport. And so they were staying home, and many people were dying in their homes. In fact, during that period, 20% of our country was orphaned. And so we felt that God was calling us to go to the rural areas. And that was in 2004. Actually, it's our 20th year of working in Eswatini. And we looked around to see who was doing what we felt God was calling us to. And there weren't any organizations in the country that were doing what we felt God wanted us to do, which was to go to ground level, like to the people. And so we founded the Luke Commission at that point.
We're going to get into specifically all the details of the Luke Commission and what you've been doing over the last 20 years. And it is incredible. But I want to start a bit with your story. I think I heard you say that you and your husband felt called to some kind of mission or medical mission as children. Tell me about that.
When I was 8 years old on a Wednesday night in church, I was sitting on the front row, and there was a missionary that was speaking. They weren't medical, but they talked a lot about all the medical needs and that there were no one to do those medical activities in their area. And I felt at that time, at 8 years old, that God was calling me overseas to work in healthcare. And my husband, when he was 17, he felt called into missions as well. And then we met when we were 19. And I can easily say we probably fell in love first with the fact that we both wanted to do the same thing in life, but we've had a wonderful time pursuing God's calling on our life together.
Now, if I remember right, both of you trained in your area of work in the U.S. Tell us what you both went into and the training you got.
My husband is a physician specialized in internal medicine and pediatrics. I am peds. And I went to PA school, and I worked mainly in surgery and pediatrics before I mostly do full-time administration work now.
Let's talk about that decision for you two to take your individual missions and bring them together. You talked about maybe even first falling in love with the fact that you both had a desire and a heart to do missions, which I love. Where was the decision made, and when to make the connection, get married, and head out on this incredible excursion?
Well, we met when we were 19. We married when we were 21, just 3 weeks after we graduated from undergrad. And then we went to medical school. And when my husband was finishing his residency, we always knew that we felt God was calling us to Africa, but we didn't know where, and we didn't know what it looked like. And then when my husband was finishing his residency, we actually did our training in Ohio. And when he was finishing his residency, we had a friend who introduced us to someone in Eswatini. And so our first stamp in our passport, either one of us out of the country ever, was to come to Eswatini in 2004.
Now, that trip in 2004, it seems, was really a life-changing experience. Talk for a moment about what you saw and experienced when you arrived there.
It was very profound and impactful what we saw. We got off the airplane and somebody took us immediately to a rural area. And what we saw were people, mostly middle-aged people, young people, 20s to 40s, in every house that we went into were dying from HIV. It was an absolute war zone on the ground. And at that time, there were no antiretrovirals, no treatment for HIV. There wasn't even a way to test someone to see if they were positive for HIV. So definitely, just in those early days. And when we talked to people, there was really, really bad stigma initially, and people felt very rejected when they thought they might be positive for HIV. And we felt at the beginning that God was really placing on our heart. He gave us a phrase: treat every last one as your mother, father, brother, sister, or child. And this has really guided us in so many decisions while we've been here. When the tough decisions come, if you ask yourself the question, what would you do if it was your mom? That really changes the perspective and gives you a filter that can actually guide you to a decision that's probably the right decision. And so in those early days, we started going, we just worked initially with a team of about 10 local staff, and my husband and I were the only medical staff, and we would travel from rural area to rural area every day, going to a different place. Initially, when we were first here, when testing first became available, when we would test for HIV, in a single day, we were diagnosing 250 people a day with HIV. If I contrast that to today, it's less than 10. So just to give you an idea, and we are 700 staff now with many moving parts, moving teams, moving all over the country with fixed sites, seeing about 1,000 people a day. So just to give you a bit of the contrast, about 1 in every 2 people was testing positive for HIV at that time.
Talk for a moment about the lack of care when you arrived. You mentioned the fact that there didn't seem to be anybody or anything really coordinating the effort to fight HIV. Give us a little picture of that. And then what led you all to say, okay, we're the ones to do this?
Well, I would say in those early days that it was, information was not shared quite in the same way it is today, where it moves faster and, people would be in certain areas and really some people felt like they were bewitched and there was other reasons why they got HIV. And so also I was speaking about the stigma, and we would ask the patients why they weren't going to the hospital, and they would say, if I have to be treated like that, let me go home and die. And we have a very quiet, shy, stoic personality in Eswatini. And unlike maybe you and I, that if somebody mistreated us in a hospital, we would write a letter to the administration and make a complaint. People were going home and dying just purely because of the fact that they did not feel love and compassion in the people who are taking care of them. And these were very important things for God to show us early on so that we would know what the manner of approach should be. And so, it's Luke Commission Compassionate Medicine is a tagline that we've used for a long time. And that really has been the cornerstone, because in a disease that's very stigmatized in a highly spiritualized environment, quickly can make people not be able to access care because of those issues that are so prevalent in society.
Talk about the beginnings of the Luke Commission. Obviously, you don't just walk into a country and set up a shop, if you will. There's a lot to it. Talk about those early days of getting the Luke Commission set up, and maybe some of the things you did initially to begin to make a difference.
Initially, what the big, I would say, mandate from God was to go to the people. Don't ask the people to come to you, because transport was such a barrier to people accessing any type of care. And we recognized quickly that the logistics of running a mobile unit, they were quite precise and need to be done in a certain way to be efficient and effective. And so we decided to start the Luke Commission. And as I mentioned before, it was very small, but I would say those first 8 years were really critical for my husband and I to be on the ground. I often say we have 386 chiefdoms in our country, and I have the dirt on my shoes of every one of those 386 chiefdoms many times. And that sows into your heart in a different way when you've walked with the people, you've walked where they walk, you are in their homes, you understand the day-to-day challenges. And so I would say that initially, as I mentioned, honestly, they made fun of us at the beginning. Like, people were saying, what are you doing? It's crazy. People would ask us, are you committing professional suicide? We were like, well, maybe, but it's what God said to do, so we're going to do it. And it was just such a blessing for those first 8 years to be able to move out in the communities. And alongside of that was the fact that my husband, when he was in his residency, we had triplet boys. So when we came here, we had a 4-year-old triplets and a 1-year-old son. And we went to these rural communities with the boys, and I had no idea how God was using them to break down stigma, because when we would go to the communities, they would just run around, and of course they would touch people and hug people, and we never stopped them from doing those things. And I didn't realize how much that was communicating through the children, that, oh, if they're not worried about their children getting HIV from touching someone or being around someone, I certainly shouldn't worry, about myself. So I think there was a lot of bridges that the kids built for us over the years. So it was, yeah, our kids did school on the bus, and when they got there, they did video school, and when they got there, they had to stay on the bus. They were done. We would be busy taking care of patients. When they would get done, they would get off and start, working with us sometimes, playing with the kids sometimes, running around like kids do. But it was a really, really precious time. And then we knew at some point that God was telling us that we cannot be the cap of what he wanted to do here, and that we needed to start training our Joshuas. And, moving from where you're the only two healthcare professionals to having a team of healthcare professionals, it just seemed very natural, because I really felt like God was moving us in a direction that the organization needed to outpace us, if I can put it that way. And it's been such a blessing just to watch over time. Our roles have shifted and changed probably 1,000 times. And we have really grown as a team now of 700, where we don't really look at individually what we're doing, but what does the big picture need? What is the most important role for you to fill, maybe for that moment or for that week or for that month or for that year, to take the organization from where we are to where God wants us to go. And it's been a real blessing just to watch the team grow. Scaling compassion then, is something that we really had to focus on. About 8 years ago, we realized that now, kind of a dozen years post us coming into the country, many of the people that were working for us were actually orphaned during the worst of the HIV pandemic. Now they're adults. They have not had any place they belong. They've been so traumatized. And we heard very clearly from God that, what are you going to do? You're taking care of everyone out there physically, but what are you going to do to heal the hearts of the adult orphans who work for you? And that was a very pivotal time in our organizational history, because we recognized that we need to put a lot of energy internally, and that's what was going to be a catalyst to being able to do exponentially more than what we could do as broken, traumatized, unprocessed, grieving human beings. And so, that process of moving from the two of us to now 700 people, I would say, has definitely been a journey, and something that God continues, to mold and shape our hearts to know what is the next step to maturity. So we're really grateful to have journeyed through this. I will also add on that when God said, what are you going to do to heal the hearts of the adult orphans who work for you? He said very quickly then too, you are also an orphan. And I think just very important for all of us to realize that the inner healing and continuous inner healing process is so critical to us operating in a state where we have excess to give, rather than always operating from a state of just being able to make it through or just surviving, but a position of thriving. So I would say that God has used a lot of these growth opportunities for us over the years to be able to prepare us for, some of the things, like I know you mentioned about the oxygen plant moving into COVID, and we had a very serious period of civil unrest in our country. And so this morphing that he's done to us over the years has really been a blessing.
I want to talk about a couple of those specifics that you just mentioned. Talk for a moment about any issues you've had with the country itself. You mentioned civil unrest. Tell us a little about that, and what happens to ministry and to service and to compassion when you're in the midst of something like that.
Eswatini historically has been known for peace. In fact, we're very proud of the fact that we are a peaceful nation. And if you look at history, it has been a peaceful nation. There's never, ever been a civil war or civil unrest in the country. And just a bit about its background. We are the last absolute monarchy in the continent of Africa, and have always, and we have one tribe because it's a small country. So we don't have those tribal challenges maybe of other African nations, a country of 1.3 million people in Southern Africa. And so we have been relatively very peaceful. Things are quite safe. And we were all very shocked in 2021 when civil unrest broke out. Of course, if you look at the timeline, COVID, our first wave of COVID was in mid-2020. And in December of 2020, our country ran out of oxygen. We were dependent on South Africa for all of our oxygen. We ran out of oxygen, and we lost a lot of lives in the second wave of COVID in Eswatini. And then in 2021, mid-2021, in June, just as the third wave was coming into the country, we had a period of very severe civil unrest to the point where our supply lines were cut off from South Africa and from Mozambique for things like fuel and oxygen and other essential supplies. And it shocked the nation, literally shocked. And we were all shell shocked, because it's just not something that's ever happened before. So I would, during those periods, even starting with COVID, there were challenges at national level with the government hospitals responding to COVID out of the normal fears that were there for everyone. And then you couple civil unrest with that, where there were the same fears and frustrations. And it really, many times during this 2-year period, our hospital was the only one receiving patients in the country. So, when I then reflect back on how God took us through this period where we really had intense focus on inner healing, I realized what he was preparing us for. Because if we would have been burnout, worn out, not working from a place of recovery or inner healing, it would have been very hard to respond in a nation being the only hospital that will actually receive patients. But that did happen on several occasions between 2020 and 2022.
Talk for a moment about just the infrastructure of the organization, and maybe on the tail end of that, when did the oxygen plant come around? In other words, do you have facilities across the country? You talked about going to people's homes. Do you have hospitals? Tell us just a little bit about the infrastructure of the Luke Commission.
For the first 8 years, we actually rented a house in a city nearby to us. And then in 2013, God opened the doors for us to be able to buy about 35 acres in the center of the country. It's very centrally located in the country. And subsequent to that, we were able to extend that to a river nearby to us. So we own about 150 acres in the middle of the country. That gave us a kilometer of riverfront access to the biggest river in Eswatini. And that was very important for our water security. This was around 2013. The land that we bought was a farm. There was a very small dairy barn that was not operational on it when we bought it. So since then, we have built 25 buildings here. We have our own construction team, steelworks, plumbing, electrical, woodworking, basically everything's done in-house. So now we have this centralized referral center that has an inpatient hospital, and we do a lot of critical care. So it has an ICU. So basically from preventative care to critical care, because we start in the communities, as I mentioned. So the community work has always been key for us, with the hospital work being a place to identify what needs to be strengthened in at community level. So one of our worst of the HIV tsunamis was that our leading cause of death for women in the country right now is cervical cancer. So recognizing that in the hospital where you have palliative cases, you have to back up to community level. So as I mentioned, for the first 8 years, we started in the communities doing outreaches, and then we bought this land, established a hospital here, mainly to admit people that we found in community level that needed hospital level care. But from this centralized site in Eswatini, we also deploy about 12 to 15 outreach teams a day. And we have one other permanent site about a half an hour from us. So that's kind of, I mean, anywhere in the country you can get in 2 hours. So being centrally located is very critical for supply chain. It's very nice to have a centralized hub. And for all of your support teams like fleet maintenance, biomed, and all those things are centralized at the Miracle Campus. But we're really grateful for the land. That was an absolute miracle, which God gave us the funding for that land in 17 days in February of 2013, just 11 years ago.
Wow. And the oxygen plant, did that come as a result of the losing that connection with South Africa that was providing oxygen at one point up to COVID time?
Well, actually, it predated that, because in the second wave, even before there was the civil unrest, we were not getting enough oxygen from South Africa because they also had an oxygen shortage during the COVID waves. And of course, if you don't have food to feed your own children, you're definitely not feeding your neighbors' kids. And that's what happened with oxygen. So then we met as a team and decided that if something was going to change, we had to have oxygen. We were willing to take care of the people. We won't push them away because we're treating them as our own family. But if you're going to cut the number of deaths, you have to have oxygen. And so we knew that it was really a crazy commitment, but we really believed God wanted us to commit to oxygen independence from South Africa by the third wave. And so we finished our plans for the oxygen plant and built it. Our team built the shell of the oxygen plant in 52 days. And we actually started producing oxygen in the country for the first time in Eswatini's history. We've never had production of oxygen in the country before, only 20 days before the civil unrest broke out and the start of the third wave started. And it was just a total miracle to watch it happen. I mean, that is a 30-minute discussion in and of itself, but just to cut it short, the ability to be able to produce our own oxygen, basically as much of it as we wanted or needed, cut the mortality rate in half in the third wave. It was really unbelievable to watch, but there was so much commitment and drive from the team to finish that plant because what they had seen happen in the second wave of COVID with not having enough oxygen.
I want to talk to you a moment about your experience there. You went there first in 2004. You're 20 years post that now, and you've seen all this growth from the two of you to 700 people working with you, the growth of the facilities, the oxygen plant, on and on. As you look back on that, what might you share about how God has impacted your lives and the lives of the people in Eswatini through the Luke Commission?
I think, we just feel like we've been standing on the sidelines watching God do his miraculous works. And, we've had a front row seat. Obviously, there's some shrapnel when you're on the front row, but it's been really an amazing journey with him. We know that it's not our strength, that it's his strength. And that's something that we're very careful to remind ourselves of every day, because sometimes if you look at the situation, it seems overwhelming. But if you rest in his promises and not demand the outcome that you think it should be, it's like he always brings something better than you could have anticipated. So I know that the team has impacted, and the work of the Luke Commission has had a great impact on Eswatini, but I would say that probably all of us feel more impacted than the work that we do. But I do think that it's amazing to think about how God created us, he as the head, and we as his hands and feet. And we know that God doesn't need us, but he wants us to be his hands and feet. And I think recognizing that God can do miracles with you or without you is important, because you're not really needed in the equation, but he has a desire for this relationship with us. And through that relationship, we get to carry out his works on this earth. And so it's just been amazing to watch what he's done. We can't explain it. It's a miracle to us as well. So we're really grateful just to have had him to lean on and carry us in so many difficult and unknown situations. But it's really been a joy to journey over the years and see what God's capable of.
A couple of quick questions about the country. Americans, the West, tend to be pretty poor when it comes to geography. I have been to Africa 7, 8 times. I have friends who live in Africa. I don't know that I've ever heard of Eswatini. Why is it that most people probably have never heard of this country?
Eswatini was actually a British protectorate, and on the 50th year of their independence, they actually changed their name back to Eswatini. It was originally Swaziland, but that was the name under the British protectorate. And when they reached their 50th year of independence, there was a decree from the king to change it back to Eswatini. And Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, located in southern Africa, about 5 hours from Johannesburg. So that's a little bit helpful for context.
Finally, regarding the country, what is the prevalent religion or religions, and how have people responded to the work that you've done in the name of Jesus?
Our prevalent religion in Eswatini is actually a mixture between Christianity, Judaism, Catholicism. My husband calls it a mushpot. Of course, all of the ancestor worship and traditional beliefs. And that's all mixed together, really. Obviously, there are other denominations, but that's the majority of our population. We would call ourselves Christians, but many of us would not have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. What has been a joy for us is that the door's already open. There's not a resistance to believing in God, but understanding that our relationship is one that we have personally with Jesus is something that a lot of people don't understand. So we are very careful to make sure that everyone that is willing has an opportunity to accept Christ, because it might not be something that they would have done even if they've grown up in church their whole life. So definitely open and fertile soil, but we need to be intentional in our giving people an opportunity to have that personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So for instance, at our hospital, our spiritual care team is up there twice every day at every change of shift, praying with the staff as they're going on and off duty, as well as praying with all the patients and giving them the opportunity to accept Christ as Savior. And definitely during COVID, there were people that were accepting Christ moments before they died. So we understand that, the medical work is just a door opener to eternal life. It's a blessing to be able to be in that door. And be able to open that door and just be able to have the opportunity to work deeply in people's lives when they're maybe in their most vulnerable moments.
How can our listeners and viewers pray for you and your team?
As a result of COVID and civil unrest, and we've had severe drug shortages in the country for various reasons, we have experienced a 450% growth in the last 4 years. And we're seeing about 300,000 patients a year now, which is about a third of the people that go to hospitals in a year in the country. And so we would really pray, ask the listeners to please pray for sustainable ways for us to continue taking care of people. It's a huge growth curve, and keeping up with that is difficult at times, but we really trust in God that there will be new ways that He supports His work.
Echo VanderWal, Executive Director of the Luke Commission. And boy, what an exciting thing that's been happening over the last 20 years in Eswatini. Her husband, just if I didn't mention his name, is Harry. I encourage you to be praying for Harry and Echo. And we'll link you to information about them and about the Luke Commission, and encourage you to check that out in today's program or podcast notes. Echo, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time, and God's continued blessings on your work there in Eswatini.
Thanks a lot, Colin. Appreciate it. Thank you.